Chapter 11. We all laughed, all four of us, a moment of release. But too much release was not good. One had to remain on one's toes. The simple truth was that Serge Lohman had a nice ass. Himself. You heard women say it often enough. He was all too aware that they found him attractive, and there was nothing wrong with that. He was photogenic. He possessed a certain, again, lewdish attractiveness. A bit too in your face and a bit too much rough timber, if you ask me, but of course, there are women who prefer plain furnishings, tables, or chairs made from authentic materials, scrap wood from old stall doors in northern Spain or Piedmont. Serge's girlfriends had usually given up on him after a few months. There was a boring, matter-of-fact side to that attractiveness. They soon tired of his pretty face. Babette was the only one who had stuck it out with him, about 18 years now, which in itself was which was something of a miracle. They had been squabbling for 18 years, and it was pretty clear that they didn't really suit each other at all, but you often see that couples for whom constant friction is the real engine of their marriage, every fight, the foreplay to the moment when they can make up in bed. But sometimes I couldn't help but think that it was all much simpler than that Babette had merely signed up for something, for a life at the side of a successful politician, and that it would have been a waste of all the time she'd invested to stop now. The way you don't put aside a bad book when you're halfway through it. You finish it reluctantly. That's the way she stayed with Serge. Perhaps their ending would make up for some of it. They had 2 children of their own, Rick, who was Michelle's age, and Valerie, a slightly autistic 13-year-old with an almost translucent, mermaid-like beauty. And then there was Beau, exact age unknown, but probably somewhere between 14 and 17. Beau came from Burkina Faso and had ended up with Serge and Babette via a development project. One of those where you support school children in the third world by buying them books and other necessities and then adopt them at a distance to start with, by means of letters and photographs and postcards, but later in the real life as well. The chosen child then lives with the Dutch foster family for a while, and if that goes well, he is allowed to stay. A sort of rento agreement. In other words, or like a cat you bring home from the animal shelter. If the cat scratches the sofa to bits or pisses all over the house, you take it back. I remember a few of the photographs and postcards Beau had sent from far away Burkina Faso. In the photo that stayed with me longest, you saw him standing in front of a red brick building with a corrugated iron roof, a pitch-black boy in a striped pajama top that reached to just above his knees, like a nightgown, his bare feet in rubber sandals. Merci beaucoup, mes parents, pour notre école, was written beneath it in a graceful schoolboy hand. Isn't he darling? Babette had said when she showed it to us. They had traveled to Burkina Faso and lost their hearts, as Serge and Babette themselves put it. A second trip followed. Forms were filled in, and a few weeks later, Beau landed at Schiphol Airport. Do you two know what you're getting into? Claire had asked them once, back in the days when the whole adoption was still at the postcard stage. They had reacted indignantly. They were helping someone, weren't they? A child who would never have the opportunities in his own country that he would in Holland. Yes, they knew very well what they were getting into. There were already far too many people in the world who thought only about themselves. You couldn't accuse them of outright egotism. Rick was 3 at the time, and Valerie was only a few months old. They weren't like most adopted parents who couldn't have children of their own. In completely selfless fashion, they were taking a third child into their home, not their own flesh and blood, but a needy child who was being offered a new life in Holland. So then what was it? What indeed were they getting into? Serge and Babette made it clear to us that this question was not to be posed, so we didn't pose the other questions either. Did Beau still have parents of his own, or was he an orphan? I have to say that Babette was more of a fanatical about the adoption than Serge was. It was her project from the start, something that she planned to carry out successfully no matter what the cost. She did everything she could to give her adopted child just as much love as her own children. In the end, the word adoption itself became too taboo. Beau is our son, that's all, she said. There is no difference. At such moments, Serge would nod in agreement. We love him just as much as we do Rick and Valerie, he said. There's a possibility, of course, that he knew even then I wouldn't want to pass judgment or accuse him of having acted with forethought, but later on it worked to his advantage. That black child from Burkina Faso, whom he loved as one of his own. It was a different sort of thing from his knowledge of wine, but it had the same effect. It gave him a face. Serge Lohman, the politician with the adopted African son. He began to pose more frequently for family photographs. It looked good. Serge and Babette on the couch with the 3 children at their feet. Beau Lohman became living proof that there was one politician who didn't act purely out of self-interest, that he, at least at one point of his life, had not acted out of self-interest. His other 2 children, after all, had been conceived in standard fashion, so it had been an act of desperation. This adoption of a child from Burkina Faso, that was the message on other issues as well. Perhaps Serge Lohman would not act purely out of self-interest. A waitress topped up Serge's glass, then mine. Babette's and Claire's were still half full. The waitress was a pretty girl, as golden blonde as Scarlett Johansson. It took her a long time filling the glasses. It was clear that she was fairly new at it and probably hadn't been working here long. First she took the bottle from the cooler and dried it completely with the white napkin draped over the bottle neck and the edge of the bucket. The pouring itself didn't go too smoothly either. She stood beside Serge's chair at such an angle that she accidentally elbowed Claire in the head. "Oh, I'm sorry," she said, and blushed deeply. Of course, Claire said right away that it was no problem, but the girl was so now flustered that she filled Serge's glass all the way up to the brim. No problem there either, except for a wine connoisseur. Hey, my brother said. "Are you trying to get me drunk or something?" He slid his chair back a couple of feet, as though the girl hadn't filled his glass too full, but had actually spilled half the bottle over his pants. Now she blushed even more deeply. She blinked her eyes, and for a moment I thought she was going to burst into tears. Like the other girls in black pinafores, she had her hair up tightly in a regulation ponytail, but its golden blondness made it look less severe than the others. She had a sweet face. I couldn't help myself. I thought about the moment when she pulled the elastic band from her ponytail and shook her hair loose. Later tonight, when her day at the restaurant was over, her terrible day, as she would tell a girlfriend or maybe a boyfriend. "You know what happened to me today? So stupid, just like me. You know how I hate all that stiff etiquette stuff with the wine bottles. Well, tonight I completely lost it. That wouldn't even be so bad, but you know who was at the table?" The girlfriend or boyfriend would look at the golden blonde hair hanging loose and say, "No, tell me, who was at the table?" For maximum effort, the girl would pause for a moment. "Serge Lohman." "Who? Serge Lohman? That cabinet minister? Or maybe he's not a real minister, but you know who I mean. He was on the news yesterday. The one who's going to win the election." It was so dumb. There was a woman at the table, too, and I smacked her right in the head with my elbow. "Oh, him, Jesus." What happened then?" "Well, nothing. He was really nice, and I could have curled up and died." Really nice, yes. Serge had been really nice. After he slid his chair back a couple of feet, then raised his head and seen the girl for the first time. In a hundredth of a second, too fast to be seen by the naked eye, I saw his expression change from feigned dismay and annoyance at the unskilled handling of his chevalise to totally empathic friendliness. How he melted, in short, the resemblance to the only recently discussed Scarlett Johansson could not have escaped even him. He saw a sweet thing, a blushing and stammering sweet thing, who was completely at his mercy. He gave her his most charming smile. "But that's okay," he said, lifting his glass and causing a substantial slug of white wine to land on his half-empty plate of oysters. "I should be able to finish it anyhow." "I'm so sorry, sir," the girl said again. "Nothing to worry about. How old are you? Are you old enough to vote?" At first I thought my ears were just playing tricks on me. Was I actually hearing this? But just at that point, my brother turned his head in my direction and gave me a big fat wink. "I'm 19, sir." "Okay, tell you what. If you vote for the right party when the elections come up, we'll do our best to overlook your wine-pouring abilities." The girl blushed again. The skin on her face turned an even darker red than before, and for the second time within a couple of minutes, I thought she was going to burst into tears. I looked over at Babette, but there was nothing to suggest that she disapproved of her husband's behavior. In fact, she seemed rather amused by it. The nationally famous politician Serge Lohmann, leader of the largest opposition party, a shoe-in for prime minister, openly flirting with 19-year-old waitresses and making them blush. Maybe this was cute. Maybe this only confirmed his irresistible charm. Or maybe she, Babette, just happens to like being married to a man like my brother. In the car on the way here, or in the parking lot, he had made her cry. But what did that amount to anyway? Was she suddenly going to leave him in the lurch now after 18 years, 6 or 7 months before the elections? I tried to reestablish eye contact with Claire, but she seemed engrossed by Serge's brimming wine glass and the waitress's stammering. She ran her hand over the back of her head over to the place where the girl's elbow had hit her. Who knows, maybe harder than it appeared. Then asked, "Are you two going to France again this summer? Or don't you have any plans yet?"
Chapter 12. Every year, Serge and Babette went to their house in the Lower Dodge with the children. They belonged to that class of Dutch people who think everything French is great, from croissants to French bread with camembert. From French cars, they themselves drove one of the top-end Piagettes to French croissants and French films. At the same time, they failed to see that the local French population of the Lower Dodge barely reached at the sight of Dutch people. Anti-Dutch slogans have been scrawled on the walls of many residences, secondaries, but according to my father, this was the work of a tiny minority. After all, wasn't everyone nice to you when you went to a shop or a restaurant? That depends, Serge said. It's still a bit up in the air. We had visited them there for the first time in a year, the three of us, on our way to Spain, the first time and the last. As Claire put it, as we resumed our trip 3 days later, my brother and his wife had insisted so often that we drop by that it had become almost embarrassing to put it off any longer. The house was in a level location, on a hill tucked away amid the trees. Glancing in the distance through the branches in the valley below, you could see a bend in the Lower Dodge River. It was muggy the whole time we were there. Not a breath of wind. Huge beetles and blowflies, of a size never seen in the Netherlands, buzzed loudly amid the leaves or flew against the windows with snacks so hard they made the glass rattle in its sashes. We were introduced to the mason who had built the open kitchen for them, to the madame who ran the bakery, and to the owner of a completely ordinary little restaurant along a tributary of the Dordogne, where all the locals go. Serge introduced me to everyone as mon petit frère. He seemed at ease among the French, each and every one of them, just regular people after all. Regular people were his specialty in Holland, so why not here as well? What barely seemed to register with him was that all those regular people were earning large sums of money off the Dutchman with his summer home and his money, and it was in part for that reason that they continued to exercise a modicum of courtesy. So kind, Serge said, so normal. Where would you find that in Holland these days? He failed to notice, or maybe he just shut his eyes to it, how the mason hawked a green tendril of chewing tobacco onto their tiled patio after mentioning the price of a shipment of authentic rural roofing tiles for the lean-to above their outdoor kitchen. How the madame at the bakery actually wanted to go on serving her customers, but stood waiting while Serge introduced his petite frère, and how those same customers exchanged knowing nods and winks that spoke volumes concerning the despicable boorishness of these Dutch people. How the joyful owner of the little restaurant squatted beside our table and said in a conspiratorial tone that he had that very day received a bag of escargots from a local farmer who normally kept them for himself. This time he had been able to buy some, though, and the owner wanted to offer them exclusively to Serge and his lovely family at a special price. The taste was something we would encounter nowhere else. Meanwhile, Serge overlooked the fact that French customers were all handed the carte du jour, an inexpensive 3-course menu at less than half the price of a single helping of snails. And concerning the wine tasting in that little restaurant, I preferred to say nothing at all. We stayed there for 3 days. During those 3 days, we also visited Chateau, where we had to stand in line in front of a house with hundreds of other foreigners, mostly Dutch, before being guided through 12 sweltering hot rooms with old poster beds and tub chairs. The rest of the time we spent largely in the air-glass garden. Claire tried to do some reading. It was too hot for me to even open a book. The white of the pages hurt your eyes, but it was difficult to do nothing at all. Serge was busy with something else. There were things around the house he did himself, things for which he did not have a local craftsman at his beck and call. The people here start to respect you when you work on your own house, he said. You notice it after a while. And so he pushed his wheelbarrow 40 times up and back between the outdoor kitchen and the provincial highway, where the rural roofing tiles had been dropped. It never occurred to him for a moment that his do-it-yourselfing might be cheating the local mason out of a considerable chunk of his paid working hours. He saved his own wood for the fireplace as well. Sometimes it looked almost like a publicity shot for his election campaign. Serge Lohman, the people's candidate, with a wheelbarrow, a saw, and burly blocks of wood. A regular man just like any other, the only difference being that a few regular men could afford a summer home in the Dordogne. Perhaps that this was the real reason why he never allowed a camera crew onto his property, as he referred to it. This is my place, he himself added. My place, for me and my family. It's no one else's business. When he wasn't lugging roofing tiles or sawing wood, he was out picking blackberries or blueberries. Blackberries and blueberries from which Babette then made jam. With her hair up in a cherry, she spent days ladling out hot, sticky, sweet substances into hundreds of canning jars. Claire had no choice but to ask if she needed help, just as I felt obligated to help Serge with his roofing tiles. Can I give you a hand? I asked after the seventh barrelful went by. Well, now that you mention it, was his reply. When can we leave? Claire asked me that night in bed when we were finally alone, cut off close. Not too close, though. It was too hot for that. The berries had turned her fingers blue. A darker version of the blue was in her hair and streaked across her cheeks. Tomorrow, I said. Oh no, I mean the day after tomorrow. On our last night, Serge and Babette invited friends and acquaintances over for dinner in the garden. They were Dutch friends and acquaintances, all of them, and they all had summer homes close by. Nothing special, Serge said. Just a little group of friends. Nice people, all of them, really. 17 Dutch people, not counting 3 of us, stood around the garden that evening with plates and glasses. There was an aging actress with no work in her husband's hair. Filled me in with the next morning. And a skinny choreographer who drank only bitter water from half-liter bottles he had brought himself, and a pair of married homosexual writers who spent the whole evening carping at each other. On the table, Babette had laid out a buffet of salads, French cheeses, curled meats, and bread. Meanwhile, Serge turned his attention to the barbecue. He was wearing a red and white check apron and grilling hamburgers and shish kebabs with bell peppers and onions. The secrets of a good barbecue is to build a good fire, he told me a few hours before the dinner with the little circle of friends. The rest is a piece of cake. My job was to collect dried twigs. Serge was drinking more than usual. A wicker bottle of wine stood beside him in the grass next to the barbecue. Maybe he was more nervous about how the evening would go than he was letting on. And Herman, they're all sitting down to potatoes and gravy right now, he said. Can you imagine it? This is the life, man. He waved his fork at the trees and bushes that kept the garden hidden from prying eyes. All the Dutch people I spoke to that evening told me more or less the same story, often in the very same words. They didn't envy their countrymen who were forced by financial considerations or other obligations to stay behind in Holland. Around here, we're as happy as God in France, said a woman who told me she had worked for years in the diet industry. I thought she was joking until I realized that she had uttered the phrase entirely in earnest, as though she had come up with it herself. I looked around at the other figures cradling their wine glasses in the golden yellow glow from the braziers and torches positioned strategically around the garden. In my mind, I heard the voice of an old actor who figured in that TV commercial 10, or was it 20 years ago? Yes, that's right. You can be happy as God in France with a good glass of cognac and a real French cheese. The mere thought brought with it a whiff of bourgeoisie, as though someone had spread a slice of toast with that filthiest of all fake cheeses and shoved it right underneath my nose. It was a combination of the lighting and the odor of bourgeoisie that kept me from seeing my brother and sister-in-law's garden party as anything but an old, outdated TV commercial from 20 years ago or longer. As as imitation cheese that had nothing to do whatsoever with French cheese. Just like here in the heart of Doge, where everyone was only playing at being in France, while the French themselves were most conspicuous by their absence. Whenever I mentioned the anti-Dutch graffiti, they all shrugged it off. Juvenile delinquents, was the verdict of the unemployed actors, while a copywriter who had sold his ad agency lock, stock, and barrel in order to settle in the door dodge assured me that the slogans were mostly aimed at Dutch campers who brought all their groceries from Holland in their trailers and didn't spend a cent in the local shops. We're not all like that, he said. We eat in the restaurants, have a peer nod in their cafes, and read their newspapers. Without people like Serge and a lot of others, there would be plenty of masons and plumbers around here without work. Let's not forget about the local winemakers, said Serge, raising his glass. Cheers. Back in the shadows, in the darkest part of the garden, beside the hedge, the skinny choreographer was making out with the younger member of the other couple. I saw a hand slip inside his shirt and looked the other way. But what if the slogan squalors didn't stop me at mere slogans? I asked myself. It probably wouldn't take much to scare off this band of cowards. The Dutch had a tendency to shit in their pants at the mere threat of real violence. You could start off by throwing rocks through windows, and if that didn't work, you could burn down a couple of residences secundarias. Not too many, because the real objective was to let those houses pass back into the hands of people who had their first claim on them. The young French newlyweds for years now had been forced by skyrocketing property prices to live with their parents. The Dutch had ruined the housing market for the local people. Astronomical sums were being paid even for ruins. With the help of relatively inexpensive French masons, the ruin was then rebuilt, only to remain uninhabited for most of the year. When you looked at it that way in a clear, cold light, it was a miracle that there had been so few real incidents, that the native population had been content merely to scrawl a little graffiti. I let my gaze travel over the lawn. Someone had put a CD by Edith Piaf. Babette, who had chosen a wide translucent black dress for the party, was executing a few unsteady, tipsy dance steps to the tune of Non Mi Rigati Rin. If broken windows and arson didn't do it, you can always take things up a notch, I told myself. You can lure one of these Dutch pussies away from his home under the pretense that you knew where there was another, even cheaper winemaker, then pound him to a pulp in some cornfield. No, not just slap him against the side of the head. No, sterner stuff, baseball bats and flails. Or if you saw one walking out on his own at a bend in the road coming from the supermarket with a shopping bag full of baguettes and red wine, you could let your car make a little skid, almost by accident. He was suddenly right there, right in front of my bumper. You could say later, or you could see nothing at all. You could leave the Dutchman lying on the edge of the road like roadkill, and when you got home, you could wash away any telltale traces of the bumper and fender. All was fair as long as the message got across. You people don't belong. Fuck off back to where you came from. Go ahead and play at me in France, in your own country, with your baguettes and red wine, but not here, not where we come from. Paul, from the middle of the lawn with her flapping gown dangerously close to the flame of one of the blazers, Babette was holding her arms out to me. The Lord was blooming from the loudspeakers. To be dancing on the grass from a village park, happy as God in France. I looked around and saw Claire standing at the table with the cheeses, and at that same moment she saw me. She was talking to the unemployed actress and threw me a desperate glance. At parties back in Holland, that meant, can't we go home, please? But we couldn't go home. We were doomed to press on to the bitter end. Tomorrow we would be allowed to go away. Hope was all Claire's look was saying now. I gestured to my in-laws, a gesture that said something like, I can't right now, but that later I would be sure to come and dance with her across the lawn and walk toward the table with all the cheeses. Alles, Ries, Milord, Chantres, Milord, Edith Piaf saying. There were, of course, stubborn characters among all those hundreds of Dutch people with summer homes in the door dodge. I talked to myself. Characters who closed their eyes to the truth, who simply wouldn't admit the fact that they were all unwanted parents around them, who, despite all the evidence to the contrary, kept insisting that it was all the work of a tiny minority. the smashed windows and the acts of arson and the battered and run-over countrymen. Perhaps those last bullheads would have to be freed from their illusions for a little more force. I thought about Straw Dogs and Deliverance, films that come to mind whenever I'm out in the sticks, but never more than here, in the Dodge dorm. On the hilltop where my brother and his wife had created what they had called their little French paradise. In Straw Dogs, the local population, after limiting themselves at first to a little badgering, take horrible revenge on the newcomers who think they've bought a cute little house in the English countryside. In Deliverance, it's the American hill police who rudely interrupt a group of city slickers on a canoeing trip.
Rape and murder featured prominently in both films. The actress looked over at me from head to toe before speaking. Your wife tells me that you'll be leaving tomorrow. Her voice has something artificially sweet to it, like the substance in Diet Coke, or the filling they use in diabetic chocolates, which say that on the package that they won't make you fat. I looked up at Claire, who rolled her eyes slightly, up at the star-studded sky. And that's what you're going to... you're going to Spain of all places. I thought about one of my favorite scenes from Straw Dogs. What would this artificial voice sound like if its owner was to be dragged into a bar by a pair of drunken French bricklayers, so drunk that they could no longer tell the difference between a woman and the ruins of a cottage, with only the walls still standing? Will she still be shooting her mouth off when the bricklayers set about rectifying her foundation? Would the voice come loose of its own accord once it was being peeled off, layer by layer? At the very moment a commotion arose at the edge of the garden, not the darkened edge with bushes where the choreographer had been groping the younger of the two rioters, but closer to the house. Along the pathway leading to the paved road, it was a group of about 5 men, Frenchmen, I saw right away, although I'd be hard-pressed to say why. Their clothes probably, which had something rural about them, without being as empathically sloppy and disheveled as these Dutch people playing at being in France. One of the men had a shotgun slung over his shoulder. Perhaps the children really had said something. Maybe they actually had asked permission to leave the party and go into the village, as Aunt Michelle continued to insist the following day. On the other hand, I hadn't really noticed that they had been gone for the last few hours. Serge's daughter, Valerie, had been in the kitchen for most of the evening watching TV. At a certain point, she had come out and said goodnight to all of us, and given her Uncle Paul 2 pecks in the cheek. Now Michel was standing between 2 Frenchmen, his head bowed. His black hair, which he had now let grow to shoulder length that summer, hung lankly along his face. One of the 2 men was holding him by the upper arm. Serge's son Rick was being held too, albeit a bit more loosely. One of the Frenchmen had his hand resting lightly on his shoulder, as though he was no longer posed a threat. It was in fact Beau, Serge's adopted son from Burkina Faso, who had arrived here among the Dutch people in the Dodge by way of the relief project for his corrugated iron school building and his new parents with a layover in Poland, who had to be held tight. He was kicking and failing. 2 other Frenchmen had twisted his arms up behind his back and finally got him onto the ground, face down in the grass of my brother's garden. Messieurs! I heard Serge call out as he hurried with giant steps towards the group, but he had already knocked back quite a bit of the local red and was clearly having a hard time walking straight at all. Messieurs! Qu'est-ce qui passe? Chapter 13. I went to the men's room, but when I came back, the main course still hadn't arrived. A new bottle of wine, however, was already on the table. The furnishings of the men's room had been thought about a bit too much. One could even wonder whether terms like men's room or toilet quite fit the bill. Water was gurgling everywhere, not only along the stainless steel seam wall, but also down the full-length mirrors in their granite frames. You could say rightfully that they were all consistent parts of a whole, consistent with the waitress's tight ponytails, their black pinafores, the Art Deco lamp on the lectern, the organic meat, and the manager's pinstriped suits. The only problem being that it was never exactly clear what the whole might boiled down to. It was sort of like certain designer glasses that add nothing to the personality of the person wearing them. On the contrary, they draw attention first and foremost to themselves. I am a pair of glasses, and don't you ever forget it. If it wasn't that I really needed to go to the toilet, I just had to get away for a moment, away from our table and all the gabbling about movies and holiday destinations. But when I took a position at the stainless steel urinal, purely for form's sake, and opened my fly, the gurgling water and the tinkling of piano music in the background suddenly made me have to go really bad. It was at that moment that I heard the door open and a new visitor entered the men's room. Now, I'm not one of those men who suddenly can't pee anymore when someone else is in the room, but it doesn't take longer. But it does take longer. It takes longer, above all, for me to get going. I cursed myself for having gone to the urinal and not into its stall. The new visitor cleared his throat a couple of times. He was also humming something that sounded vaguely familiar, a melody I recognized only a second later as killing me softly with his song. By God damn it, what was that woman's name again? Roberta Flack? Bingo! I prayed to God that the man would go find a toilet of his own, but from the corner of my eye I saw him step to the peen wall just a few feet away from me. He made the usual motion, and after only a few seconds I heard the sound of a steady, powerful jet of urine clattering against the water streaming down the wall. It was the sort of jet that seemed particularly pleased with itself, that wants nothing more than to demonstrate its own boundless good health, and that probably once back in primary school belonged to the little boy who could pee farther than anyone else, all the way across the ditch. I looked up and saw that the owner of the jet was the man with the beard. The man with the beard who had been sitting with his objectingly young girlfriend at the table next to ours. Just then the man looked over too. We both nodded vaguely, as is customary when two men stand 3 feet apart to take a piss. From within the beard, the man's mouth twisted into a grin, a triumphant grin. I couldn't help thinking the typical grin of a man with a powerful jet, a grin that was amused by men who had more trouble peeing than he did. After all, it wasn't a powerful jet also a sign of manliness? Didn't it perhaps give its owner right of primacy when it came to the available women? And conversely, it wasn't a cowardly triple an indication that there were probably other things that didn't flow right down there. Indeed, that the survival of the species would be endangered for women to shrug indifferently at such dribbling and no longer let themselves be drawn to the healthy sound of a powerful jet. There were no partitions between us. All I would have to do was open my eyes to catch sight of the dick that went along with the bearded man. Judging from the clatter, it had to be a big dick. I thought to myself, a big cock of the shameless variety, with thick blue veins right below the surface of the darkish gray skin that was brutally healthy, yet still rather rough, the sort of dick that might tempt a man to spend his holidays at a nudist camp, or in any event to purchase the smallest model, slip the buy-in of the flimsiest material possible. The reason why I had excused myself and gone to the men's room was because it was all becoming too much for me. By way of holiday destinations and the door dodge, we had ended up at racism. My wife had supported me in my position that muffling away racism and pretending it wasn't there only made the problem worse. Out of the blue and without even looking at me, she came to my aid. I think that what Paul means is that was how she started, by putting into words what she thought I was trying to say. Coming from anyone but Claire, it could have sounded denigrating or patronizing or condescending, as though I was unable to express my own opinions in words another person could understand. But coming from Claire, I think that what Paul meant nothing more and nothing less than that the others were too slow on the uptake, too thick to grasp a point that her husband was holding up before their eyes in an extremely clear and obvious fashion, and that she was starting to lose patience. After that, we went back to films for a bit. Claire said that Guess Who's Coming to Dinner was the most racist movie ever. Everyone knows the story. Set in the late 1960s, the daughter of a wealthy white couple, played by Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn,
brings her new fiancé home to meet her parents. To their great dismay, the fiancé, played by Sidney Poitier, turns out to be black. During dinner, the truth gradually becomes clear. The black man is a good black man, an intelligent black man in a nice suit, a university professor. In intellectual terms, he is far superior to the white parents of his fiancée, who are mediocre, upper middle class type, chock full of prejudices concerning Negroes. And that's precisely where the racist hook comes in those prejudices. Claire had said the black people the parents know about from TV and the neighborhoods where they're afraid to go are poor and lazy and violent criminals. But their future son-in-law, fortunately, is a well-adapted Negro who has put on the white man's neat three-piece suit in order to look as much as the white man as he can. Serge looked up at my wife with the look of an interested listener, but his body language betrayed the fact that he found it hard to listen to any woman he couldn't immediately place in simple categories like tits, nice ass, or wouldn't kick her out of bed for eating crackers. It wasn't until much later that the first unadapted blacks appeared in movies, Claire said. Blacks who wore baseball caps and drove flashy cars. Violent blacks from the worst neighborhoods. But at least they were themselves. They were no longer some watered-down version of a white man. At that point, my brother coughed and cleared his throat. He sat up straight, then leaned over the table as though he was searching for the microphone. That's exactly what I looked like, I thought to myself. In all his movements, he was suddenly the national politician again, the show-in to be our country's next leader, and he was about to put her in her place. A woman in the audience in some provincial union hall.
And what's so bad about adapted black people, Claire? He said, I mean, to hear you tell it, you'd rather have them remain themselves, even if that means they go on killing each other in their ghettos over a few grams of crack, with no prospect of improvement. I looked at my wife. In my thoughts, I egged her on to deliver my brother the goût de grace. He had set it up and she could knock it in, as they say. It was just too ghastly the way he tried to inject his own party platform into a normal discussion about people and the differences between them. Improvement. A word, nothing more. Crap dished up for the constituency. I'm not talking about improvement, Serge, Claire said. I'm talking about the way we Dutch people, white people, Europeans look at other cultures. The things we're afraid of. If a group of dark-skinned men was coming towards you down the sidewalk, wouldn't you feel a stronger urge to cross the street if they were wearing baseball caps rather than neat clothing, like yours or mine? Or like diplomats or office clerks. I never cross the street. I believe we should approach everyone as equals. You mentioned the things we're afraid of. I agree with you about that. If we would just stop being afraid, then we could go on to cultivate more understanding for each other. Serge, I'm not some debating partner you need to wow with hollow terms like improvement and understanding. I'm your sister-in-law, your brother's wife. It's just the four of us here now, as friends, as family. What it's about is the right to be a prick, I said. A brief silence fell. The proverbial silence in which you could hear a pin drop. Had that not been ruled out already by the noise of the busy restaurant, it would be going too far to claim that all heads turned in my direction the way you read sometimes. But attention was being paid. Babette giggled. Paul, she said. No, but I was suddenly reminded of a TV program that was on years ago, I said. I can't remember the name of it anymore. I remembered very well, but had no desire to mention the name of the program. That would only be a distraction. The name of the program might prompt my brother to make some sarcastic comment, to try to take the edge off my real message before I even had a chance to deliver it. I didn't know you watched things like that kind of comment. It was about homos. They interviewed an older lady who lived downstairs from two homosexual men, two young men who lived together and took care of her cat sometimes. Such sweet boys, the lady said. What she really meant to say that even though her two neighbors were homosexual, the way they took care of her cats when she was gone showed that they were still people like you and me. The lady sat there beaming smugly because now everyone could see how tolerant she was. Her upstairs neighbors were sweet boys, even if they do dirty things to each other. Objectable things, actually unhealthy and unnatural. Perversions
In other words, that were nonetheless mitigated by the boy's selfless care for her cats. I paused for a moment, but Babette smiled. Serge had raised his eyebrow a couple of times, and Claire, my wife, looked amused, the look she gave me when she knew where things were going from here. In order to understand what this lady was saying about her upstairs neighbors, I went on, because no one else was saying anything, you have to turn the situation around. If the two sweet homosexuals hadn't feed the cat at all, but instead had pelted them with stones or tossed poisoned pork chops down to them from their balcony, then they would have just been plain dirty faggots. I think that's what Claire meant about guess who's coming to dinner. That's the friendly, spinny Potier was a sweet boy too. That the person who made that movie was absolutely no better than the lady in that program. In fact, Sidney Poitier was supposed to serve as a role model, an example for all those nasty Negroes, the uppity Negroes, the dangerous Negroes, the muggers and the rapists and the crack dealers. When you people put on a good-looking suit like Sidney's and start behaving like the perfect son-in-law, we white folks will be your friends.
Chapter 14. The man with the beard was drying his hands. I pulled up my zipper as a sign I was finished peeing, even though it had pronounced no sound, and made straight for the exit. My hand was already on the stainless steel door handle when I heard the man with the beard say, "Isn't it difficult for that friend of yours, sometimes going to a restaurant when he has such a familiar face?" I stopped. Without letting go of the handle, I turned and looked at him. The man with the beard was still drying his hands with a clump of paper towels. Within the abundant growth of his beard, his mouth had once again twisted itself into a grin, but not a triumphant grin this time, but more like a cowardly baring of the teeth. I have no bad intentions, the grin was saying. He's not my friend, I said. The grin vanished. The hands stopped their drying as well. Oh, excuse me, he said. I just saw you sitting there. My daughter and I, we figured, just keep acting normal. Let's not gawk at him. I said nothing. The revelation about the daughter had done me more good than I cared to admit. The beard, despite his unabashed jet, had not succeeded in hooking a woman 30 years his junior. He tossed the wet clump of paper into a stainless steel trash bin. It was one of those bins with a spring-loaded lid, which made it hard for him to get it all in one shot. I was wondering, he said, whether perhaps it was possible. My daughter and I, we both feel like our country is in need of a change. She's studying political science. I was wondering whether maybe she could have her picture taken with Mr. Lohman later on. He had pulled a flat, shiny camera from the pocket of his jacket. It would only take a second, he said. I realize that it's a private dinner for you and everything, and I don't want to bother him. My daughter would never forgive me if she knew I even dared to ask this. She was the one who said it wasn't right to stare at a famous politician in a restaurant, that you should leave him alone during his few private moments, and that you absolutely shouldn't try to have your picture taken with him. But on the other hand, I know how wonderful it would be for her to have her picture taken with Serge Lohman, I looked at him. I wondered what it would be like to have a father whose face you couldn't see. Whether a day would finally come when, as the daughter of a father like that, you simply lost patience, or whether you got used to it, like bad wallpaper. No problem at all, I said. Mr. Lohman is always pleased to come in contact with his supporters. We're in the middle of an important discussion right now, but just keep your eye on me. When I give you the sign, that will be the right moment for a photo. Chapter 15. The first thing I noticed when I came back from the men's room was the silence at our table. The kind of tense silence that tells you right away that you missed something important. I had come back into the dining room along with the beard. He was in front of me, so I only noticed the silence once I was already close to our table. Or no, there was something else I noticed first. My wife's hand, reaching out diagonally across the tablecloth, holding Babette's. My brother was staring at his empty plate, and it was only after I settled down in my chair that I realized Babette was crying. A soundless weeping, a barely perceptible shaking of the shoulders, a tremor in her arm, the arm attached to the hand that Claire was holding. I saw and made eye contact with my wife. Claire raised her eyebrows and tossed a meaningful glance in the direction of my brother. At that same moment, Serge raised his head, looked at me sheepishly, and shrugged. "Well, Paul, you're in luck," he said. "Maybe you should have stayed in the bathroom a little longer." Babette yanked her hand away from
Claire seized her napkin from her lap and tossed it onto her plate. "You are such an unbelievable shithead," she said to Serge, sliding back her chair. The next moment she was walking past the other tables, heading for the toilets, or the exit, I thought. But it didn't seem likely that she would leave us. Her body language, the subdued pace at which she moved past the tables, told me that she was hoping one of us would come after her. And indeed, my brother began getting up from his chair. Claire laid a hand on his forearm. "Let me go to her for a moment, Serge," she said, and stood up. She, too, hurried off past the other tables. By now, Babette had disappeared from view, so I couldn't tell whether she had gone for the toilets or a breath of fresh air. My brother and I looked at each other. He made an attempt at a feeble smile, but it didn't really work. He began. He looked around, then brought his head closer to mine. "This isn't what you think," he said then, so quietly that I could barely understand him. There was something about his head, about his face. It was still the same head and the same face, but it was like it was suspended in air with no clear link to a body, without even a coherent thought. He reminded me of a cartoon character who just had a chair kicked out from under him. The cartoon character remains hanging in space for a moment before he realizes that the chair is no longer there. If he wore this face while passing out flyers on the street, I thought, flyers calling upon ordinary, everyday people to be sure to vote for him in the coming elections, no one would give him a second look. The face made you think of a brand new car fresh from the showroom that rounds the first corner, swipes the lamppost, and gets a big scratch down its side. No one would want a car like that. Serge got up and moved to the chair across from me. The chair was Claire's. It belonged to my wife. Without a doubt, he could now feel her body heat, left behind on the seat, right through the cloth of his trousers. The thought of it made me furious. "Okay, that makes it easier for us to talk," he said. I didn't say a thing. I won't deny that this was how I liked to see my brother, floundering. I wasn't about to throw him a life boy. "She's been having a hard time lately with, well, you know, I've always hated that word," he said. "The menopause. It sounds like something that would never happen to our wives." He paused. The pause was probably meant for me to say something about Claire and the menopause, our wives. That's what he'd said, but it was none of his business. Whatever was wrong or right with Claire, that was private. "It's the hormones," he went on. "First the room's too warm and all the windows have to be open. The next moment she's suddenly all weepy." He turned his still visibly shaken head toward the restrooms, the door, and then back to me. "Maybe it's good for her to talk about it with another woman. You know what I mean, girl talk, at moments like this. I can't do anything right anyway." He grinned. I didn't grin back. He raised his arms from the tabletop and flapped his wrists. Then he leaned his elbows on the table and pressed his fingertips together. He looked over his shoulder again. "There's something else we should really talk about, though, Paul," he said. I felt something cold and hard inside me, something cold and hard that had been there all evening, grow a little colder and harder. "We need to talk about our children," said Sir Sloman. I nodded. I looked across the aisle and nodded again. The man with the beard had already looked our way a few times. For clarity's sake, I nodded a third time. The man with the beard nodded back. I saw him put down his knife and fork, lean over to his daughter, and whisper something to her. The daughter grabbed her handbag and began rummaging through it. Meanwhile, her father pulled the camera out of his coat pocket and rose from his chair.
Main course. Chapter 16. "Grapes," the manager said. His pinky was hovering less than a quarter of an inch over the minuscule bunch of fruitlets that I thought at first were berries. White currants or something. I didn't know anything about berries, really, except that most types were inedible to humans. The grapes were lying beside a deep purple piece of lettuce, a full 2 inches of empty plate away from the actual main course. Fillet of guinea fowl, wrapped in a paper-thin sliced German bacon. Serge's plate featured the tiny cluster and the shred of lettuce too, for my brother had ordered the tornitos. There's not a whole lot you can say about a tornitos, except that it's a piece of meat. But because something had to be said, the manager provided a brief account of where the tornitos came from, of the organic farm where the animals lived in freedom until they were butchered. I could see Serge's impatience. He was hungry in the way only Serge can be hungry. I recognized the symptoms. The tip of his tongue sweeping across his upper lip, like the tongue of a ravenous dog in a cartoon. The rubbing together of the hands that an outsider could take for delighted anticipation, but which was absolutely anything but. My brother was not delighting in anticipation. There was a tornadoes on his plate, and that tornadoes had to be wolfed down as quickly as possible. He needed to eat now. The only reason I had asked the manager about the grapes was to torment my brother. Babette and Claire weren't back yet, but what did he care? They'll be here any minute now, he'd said when no less than 4 girls in black pinafores had showed up with their main courses, trailing the manager in their wake. The manager asked whether we would like them to wait with this course until our wives had returned, but Serge squashed that immediately. Please, just put it down, he said. His tongue was already moving across his upper lip, and the hand rubbing was beyond his control. The manager's little finger pointed first to my Guiana hen filet rolled in German bacon, and then at the side dishes, a little heap of lasagna slices with eggplant and ricotta, held together with a toothpick that reminded me of a miniature club sandwich, and an ear of corn impaled at both ends on a spring. The spring was probably meant to enable you to pick up the corn without getting your fingers greasy, but it had, above all, something laughable about it, or not laughable, more like something intended to be funny. An ironic nod from the chef, something like that. The spring was chrome-plated and stuck out about an inch from either end of the corn cob, which glistened with butter. I'm not particularly fond of corn that way. Gnawing at an ear of corn I've always found disgusting. You get too little to eat and too much remains stuck between your teeth, while the butter goes dripping down your chin. Besides, I'd never been able to shake the idea that corn cobs, first and foremost, are pig feed. After the manager had described the organic conditions on the farm where Serge's tornadoes had been cut from, a cow, and promised that he would come back in a little bit to elucidate the contents of our wives' plates, I pointed to the little bunch of berries. Are those by any chance white currants? I asked. Serge had already plunged his fork into the tornadoes. He was poised to cut off a piece. His right hand holding the steak knife was hovering over his plate. The manager had already turned to walk away, but now he turned back. As his pinky approached the bunch of grapelets, I looked at Serge's face. That face radiated impatience. That above all, impatience and irritation at this new delay. He'd had no qualms about starting in on his little fillet of beef in the absence of Babette and Claire, but he couldn't stand the idea of sinking his teeth into it with a stranger hanging around. What was all that about berries? He asked after the manager had finally walked away and we were alone at last. Since when are you interested in berries? He cut off a large chunk of his tornadoes and stuck it in his mouth. The chewing took 10 seconds at the very most. After swallowing, he stared into space for a few moments. It looked as though he were waiting for the next meat to hit his stomach. Then he applied his knife and fork to the plate again. I got up. What is it now? Serge asked. I'm going to see what's taking them so long, I said. Chapter 17. I tried the ladies' room first, carefully so I wouldn't startle anyone. I pushed the door open a crack. Claire? Except for the absence of a peeing wall, the room was identical to the men's, stainless steel, granite, and piano music. The only difference was the vase of white daffodils, positioned between the two sinks. I thought about the owner of the restaurant, about his white turtleneck. Babette, calling my sister-in-law's name, was only a formality, an excuse for being in the doorway of the ladies' toilet at all. Should anyone be actually in one of the stalls, which didn't seem to be the case. I walked to the front door, past the cloakroom and the girls at the lectern. It was pleasantly warm outside. A full moon hung between the treetops, and it smelled of herbs, a smell I couldn't quite place, but that seemed almost Mediterranean. A little farther along, at the edge of the park, I saw the lights of cars and a passing tram. And farther still, through the bushes, the lighted windows of the bar where at this very moment the regular people were settling down to their spare ribs. I walked down the gravel pathway with its electric torches and turned left along a path that cut around the restaurant. To my right was the footbridge across a ditch, which led to the street with its traffic, and the bar serving spare ribs. To my left was a rectangular pool. Farther back, where the pool dissolved into darkness, I saw something that I took at first to be a wall, but which on closer inspection turned out to be a head-high hedge. Turning left again, I walked along the edge of the pool. The light from the restaurant was reflected in the dark water. From here you could see the diners at their tables. I went on a bit, then stopped. There was no more than 30 feet between us, but I could still see my brother sitting at our table, and he couldn't see me. As we had waited for the main dish, I had looked outside any number of times, but with the falling of darkness, had been able to see less and less. From where I saw, however, I was able to see almost the entire restaurant reflected in the glass. Serge would have to press his face up against the window, and then perhaps he would see me standing here. But even then it wasn't certain that he would see anything more than a dark form across the pool. I looked around. As far as I could tell in the dark, the park was deserted. Not a sign of Claire and Babette. My brother had put down his knife and fork and was wiping his mouth with a napkin. From here I couldn't see his plate, but I would have bet that there was nothing left on it. The eating had been done. The feeling of hunger was a thing of the past. Serge raised his glass to his lips and drank. Just at that moment, the man with the beard and his daughter stood up from their table. On their way to the door, they paused beside Serge's table. I saw the man with the beard raise his hand. The daughter smiled at him, and Serge raised his glass by way of greeting. Undoubtedly, they had wanted to thank him again for the meet and greet. Serge had indeed been the very picture of courtesy. He had paused seamlessly and in an instant from his role as diner, in need of privacy, to that of nationally known face, a nationally known face that had always reminded itself a regular person, a person like you and me, someone you could come up and talk to any time and anywhere because he never placed himself on a pedestal. I suppose I was the only one who noticed the wrinkle of irritation on his brow when the man with the beard had come over to him the first time. "Please do excuse me, but this gentleman assured me that it would be no problem if we..." The wrinkle was there for no more than a second. After that, we were shown the Serge Loman anyone could feel good about voting for, the prime ministerial candidate who felt at ease among the common people. Of course, he cried joyfully when the beard showed him the camera and pointed to his daughter. "And what's your name?" Serge had asked the girl. She wasn't a particularly pretty girl, not the kind of girl who produced that naughty glint in my brother's eye, not a girl whom he would try to show off, as he had earlier with the clumsy waitress, the Scarlett Johansson look-alike. She did have a nice face, though, an intellect face, I corrected myself. Too intelligent, in fact, to want to have her picture taken with my brother. "Naomi," she replied. "Come sit next to me, Naomi," Serge said, and when the girl had settled down in the empty chair, he put his arm around her shoulders. The beard took a few steps back. "And now one for the scrapbook," he said after the camera had flashed once, and he took another one. The photo moment had caused a certain amount of commotion. The people at the tables next to ours had, it's true, acted as though there had been no photo moment, but it was just as with Serge's entrance earlier that evening. Even when you act like nothing is happening, something happens. I don't know how to put it any more clearly. It's like walking right past an accident because you don't like the sight of blood. Or no, let's scale it down a bit. Like an animal that's been hit and is lying dead at the side of the road. You see it, you saw the dead animal from a ways back already, but you don't look at it anymore. You don't feel like seeing the blood and guts spilling out. And so you look at something somewhere elsewhere, at the sky, for example, or a flowering bush in the field farther along, or at anything except the side of the road. Serge had been awfully joyful, putting his arm around her shoulders like that. He had pulled the girl over a little closer and then leaned his head to one side, leaned his head so far that their heads almost touched. The result was probably a wonderful photo. The beard's daughter probably couldn't have asked for a better photo, but I have the distinct impression that Serge wouldn't have been so joyful if it had been Scarlett Johansson or a Scarlett Johansson lookalike beside him instead of that girl. "We'd like to thank you very much," the man with a beard had said. "We won't bother you anymore. You're here in a private capacity." The girl, Naomi, hadn't spoken a word. She pushed her chair back and went to stand beside her father. But they still didn't go away. "Does this happen often?" the beard asked, leaning over a little so that his head was just over the table. He was also speaking more quietly, more confidently. "That people just come up to you and ask to have their picture taken with you?" My brother stared at him. The wrinkle between his eyebrows was back. What more did they want from him? The wrinkle said. The beard and his daughter had just had their joyful moment. Now they should just fuck off. For once I couldn't blame him. I had seen it happen before, the way people hung around Serge Loman too long. They couldn't take leave of him. They just wanted the moment to last longer. Yes, they almost always wanted a little bit more. A photograph or an autograph wasn't enough. They wanted something exclusive, an exclusive treatment, and a distinction had to be made between them and all the others who came up and asked for a photo or an autograph. They were looking for a story they could tell everyone the next day. "You know who I met last night? Yeah, that's the one. So nice, so normal. We thought that after the picture was taken, he would want to be left alone, but he didn't, not at all. He invited us to sit down at his table and insisted we have a drink with him. I don't think everyone with a famous face would do that, but he did, and it was late by the time we left." Serge looked at the man with the beard. The wrinkle between his eyebrows had become more pronounced, but an outsider might have mistaken it for the frown of someone whose eyes were pained by looking into the light. He slid his knife across the tablecloth away from his plate, and then back again. I knew the dilemma that he was struggling with. I had been there more often than I had liked. My brother wanted to be left alone. He had shown the sunniest side of his character. He had let the father immortalize him with his arm around the daughter's shoulder. He was normal. He was human. Anyone who voted for Serge Loman was voting for a normal and human prime minister. But now that the beard just kept standing there, waiting for even more free chit-chat with which he could show off in front of his colleagues on Monday morning, Serge had to control himself. One cutting or even mildly sarcastic comment could ruin everything, and then the entire charm offensive would have been pointless. On Monday, the beard would tell his colleagues what an arrogant shit Serge Loman had turned out to be, a man who put on airs. After all, the beard and his daughter hadn't been bothering him. All they did ask was for a picture, and then left him to his little private dinner party. Among those colleagues, there would be 2 or 3 who wouldn't vote for Serge Loman after hearing that. In fact, it was quite possible that those 2 or 3 colleagues would pass along the story about the arrogant, unapproachable party leader, the so-called snowball effect. As with all the slander, the story would have taken on an increasing grotesque form every time it was told. The highly relatable gossip would spread like wildfire, telling how Serge Loman had treated someone with contempt, an ordinary father and his daughter who had asked politely to have their picture taken with him. In a later version, the candidate for prime minister would have thrown the 2 out of the restaurant on their ears. Even though he had only himself to blame for this, at that moment I felt sorry for my brother. I had always sympathized with the movie stars and rock idols who went after the paparazzi lying in wait for them outside the club and broke their cameras. Had Serge decided to take a swing and smacked the beard right in his face, whether that might be hidden behind those despicably laughable or laughably despicable leprechaunically bristles, he could have counted on me 100%. I would have twisted the beard's arm behind his back, I thought to myself, so that Serge could concentrate on smashing his face. He would, after all, have to throw a little bit more weight into the punches in order to damage anything behind all that hair. Without exaggerating, you could say that Serge was of 2 minds when it came to public attention. All those moments and on those occasions when he is the public sweetheart, during his speeches in provincial union halls, when he answers questions from the audience of the rank and file, or in front of the TV cameras or radio microphones, when he stands in a street market in a window breaker, handing out campaign flyers and talking to regular people, or when he stands at the lectern and lets the applause roll over him. No, what I'm saying, the continuous standing ovation that lasted for minutes at the last party congress. Flowers were thrown onto the podium spontaneously, it was said, but in fact carefully stage-directed by his campaign manager. At moments like this, he shines. It's not just not a matter of beaming with pride or self-importance, or because politicians who want to get ahead simply have to beam, because otherwise the campaign might end tomorrow. No, he really shines. He radiates something. Every time I've seen it, it has surprised me. It is surprising and amazing to behold how my brother, the oaf, the lumpen boar who has to just eat now and scarfs down his tornadoes joylessly in 3 bites, the easily bored dullard whose eyes start to wander at every subject that doesn't have to do with him, how this brother of mine on a podium and in the spotlights and on TV literally begins to shine, how, in other words, he becomes a politician with charisma. It's his magic, says the hostess of a young people's program in an interview with a women's magazine. When you get close to him, something happens. I happened to see that particular episode of a young people's program, and it was clear what Serge did. First of all, he never stopped smiling. He's taught himself to do that. His eyes don't smile along, which is how you can tell it's not for real. But he still smiles. He smiles at people like that. For the rest, throughout most of the interview, he stood with his hands in his pocket, not bored or blasé, but casual, as though he was standing in a schoolyard. A schoolyard was not far off the mark, actually, because the interview was done in some noisily and poorly lit youth club after a speech there. He was too old to pass for a schoolboy, but he was the nicest teacher of them all, the teacher you can confide in, who sometimes says shit or cool. The teacher with a tie, who during the field trip to Paris gets a little tipsy at the hotel bar along with everyone else. Occasionally, Serge took the hand out of his pocket to illustrate with a gesture some point from the party program, and then it was as though he was going to run that hand through the hostess's hair, or say that her hair was nice. But in private, all that changes, like everyone with a famous face. He also has the look. Whenever he goes into some place in a private capacity, he never looks straight at anyone. His eyes dart around without fixing on any living person. He looks at ceilings and the lamps hanging from those ceilings, at tables, at chairs, at the framed prints on the wall. What he would really like to do is look at nothing at all. And the whole time he grins. It's the grin of someone who knows that everyone is looking at him, or purposely not looking at him, which boils down to the same thing. Sometimes it's hard for him to keep down those two things, the public property and the private circumstances, separate. Then you see him thinking that maybe it's not such a bad idea to profit a little from the public interest during his private moments, like tonight in the restaurant. He looked at the man with the beard and then at me. The wrinkle was gone. He winked, and the next moment he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his cell phone. "Excuse me, would you?" he said, taking a look at the display. "I'm afraid I have to take this." He smiled apologetically at the beard, pressed the key, and raised the phone to his ear. There had been no sound, no old-fashioned ringing, no special ringtone with a little tune, but it was possible. There was plenty of background noise that could have prevented the beard and Naomi from hearing anything, or who knows, maybe he just had the phone set to vibrate. Who could say? Certainly not the beard. For him, the moment had arrived to slink away empty-handed. Of course, he might have had his doubts about the phone call. He had every reason to think he was being flammed, but experience showed that people didn't do that. It ruined their story. They had their picture taken with the future Prime Minister of Netherlands. They had talked to him a little bit, but he was a busy man too. "Oh," Serge said into the phone. "Where?" He was no longer looking at the beard and his daughter, but he was looking outside. As far as he was concerned, they had already left. It was, I must admit, a great bit of acting. I'm having dinner at the moment," he said, and looked at his watch. He mentioned the name of the restaurant. "No, I won't be able to do that before midnight," he said. I felt it was my duty to look at the man with the beard. I was the receptionist who showed the patient to the door, because the doctor himself had to deal with the next patient. I gestured not an apologetic gesture, but one that more or less said that he and his daughter could now withdraw without suffering any loss of faith. These are the times when you ask yourself what you do it for. My brother sighed when we were alone again and he had put away his cell phone. Jesus Christ, those are the worst. The ones who just won't go away. If the girl had at least been a little bit He winked. Oh, I'm sorry, Paul, I forgot. You like them like that. The wallflowers. He grinned at his own little joke, and I grinned along with him, looking toward the door to see if Claire and Babette were on their way back. But then, before I expected it, Serge grew serious again. He put his elbows on the table and formed a little bridge with his fingertips. So what were we talking about, he said. And then they came with the main course. Chapter 18. And then I was standing outside, looking from a distance at my brother, who was sitting down at our table all alone. I was sorely tempted to spend the rest of the evening out here, or at least not go back inside. I heard an electric beep that I couldn't place at first, followed by other beeps that together seemed to form a melody. What it resembled most was the ringtone coming from a cell phone, but not my own. Still, undeniably, it was coming from the pocket of my own blazer, the right pocket. I'm left-handed. I always put my cell in my left-hand pocket. I slid my right hand into the pocket in his belt, in addition to the familiar key ring, and something hard that I knew had to be an open pack of stilly moral, an object that can only be a phone. Before I had time to even pull it out, I realized what was going on. How Michelle's phone had ended up in my pocket was something I couldn't reconstruct immediately, but I still found myself faced with the simple fact that someone was calling Michelle on his cell phone. Now that it was no longer muffled by the fabric of my blazer, the ringtone was awfully loud, so loud that I was afraid people might hear it all over the park. Fuck, I said. The best thing, of course, would be to let the phone go on ringing until it switched to voicemail. On the other hand, I wanted it to stop making the noise right away. On the other hand, I was curious about who was calling. I looked at the display to see whether it might recognize the name, but reading proved unnecessary. The display lit up in the dark, and even though the features were a bit blurry, I had no trouble recognizing my own wife's face. Claire, for some reason, was calling her son, and there was only one way to find out what that reason was. Claire, I said after sliding the phone open. There was no sound. Claire? I said it again. I looked around a few times. It wasn't hard to imagine my wife would suddenly pop up from up behind a tree. Surprise! It was all a joke. Even if it was a joke, I didn't quite get at the moment. Dad? Michelle, where are you? At home. I couldn't. But where are you? At the restaurant? We told you. But how did I get your cell phone? I wanted to say. But suddenly it didn't seem like a good question to ask. But what are you doing with my cell phone? My son asked then. He didn't sound upset, more surprised like me. His room earlier that evening, his phone on the table. What were you doing up here? You said you were looking for me. Why were you looking for me? Did I have his phone in my hand at that moment? Or had I already put it back on the table? I was looking for you. Could I really have? But then I would have I would have had to have my blazer on already. I never wear blazers around the house. I tried to think why would I have gone upstairs wearing my blazer to my son's room? I have no idea, I said in the meanwhile, sounding as casual as I could. I'm just as surprised as you are. I mean, they sort of look alike, our cell phones, but I can hardly imagine that I couldn't find it anywhere, Michelle butted in, so I called my own number to see if I could hear it ring somewhere. His mother's picture on the screen. He had called from home. The screen on his phone showed a picture of his mother. When anyone called him from our landline, not a picture of his father, it flashed through my mind. Or the two of us at the same moment. I realized how ridiculous that would be. A picture of his parents on the couch in the living room, smiling with their arms around each other, a happy marriage. Daddy and Mommy are calling. Daddy and Mommy want to talk to me. Daddy and Mommy love me more than anyone else in the world. I'm sorry, Guy. I guess I was stupid enough to put your cell phone in my pocket. Your father must have had a senior moment. Home was Mama. Home was Claire. I didn't feel left out. I noticed somehow it actually was a comfort. We won't be home late. We'll just have it back in a couple of hours. Where are you guys? Oh yeah, you went
Dinner. You said that already. Isn't that the restaurant in the park across from... Michelle mentioned the name of a regular people cafe. That's not very far. Don't bother. You'll still have it back before you know it, an hour or so, max. Did I still sound lighthearted, cheerful? Or could you tell from my voice that I didn't really want him to come to the restaurant and pick up his phone? I can't wait that long. I need some numbers. I have to call someone. Did I actually hear him hesitate there, or was it just that the connection was lost for a moment? I'll look for you if you want. If you tell me which number you need. No, that was completely the wrong tone. I had no desire to be that kind of easygoing fun to be around Dad. A father who's allowed to poke around in his son's cell phone because father and son, after all, have nothing to hide from each other. I was already so grateful that Mitchell still called me Dad and not Paul. There was something about that first-name basis business that had always appalled me. Children of 7 who called their father George or their mother Wilma. It was freeness and easiness of the wrong sort, and at the end of the day, it would always backfire on the all too free and easy parents. It was only a small step from George and Wilma to, but I said I wanted peanut butter, didn't I, George? After which the sandwich with chocolate sprinkles is sent back to the kitchen and disappears into the garbage. I've seen them long enough in my own surroundings. Parents who laugh rather sheepishly when their children speak to them in that tone of voice. Oh, you know, these days they hit adolescence a lot earlier. It's how they try to smooth it over. But they are too short-sighted or simply too cowardly to realize they have called this reign of terror upon themselves. In their heart of hearts, of course, what they hope is that their children would go on liking them for longer as George and Wilma than they would as Mom and Dad. As a father who looked at the contents of his 15-year-old son's cell phone was getting too close, he could see right away how many girls were in the contest, or which raunchy photos had been downloaded as screen wallpaper. No, my son and I did have things to hide. We respected each other's privacy. We knocked on the door of the other's room when it was closed, and we did not, for example, walk in and out of the bathroom naked without towels around our waist simply because there was nothing to hide, as was common in George and Wilma families. No, not that at all. But I had already snooped around in Mitchell's phone. I had seen things that weren't meant for me. From Mitchell's point of view, it was mortally dangerous for me to hold on to his phone any longer than it was absolutely necessary. No, that's okay, Dad. I'm coming to get it right now. Mitchell? I said, but he had already hung up. Fuck. I shouted for the second time that evening, and at that same moment I saw Claire and Babette emerging from behind the tall hedge. My wife had her arm around her sister-in-law's shoulder. It only took a few blinks of an eye. During those blinks, I thought about stepping back and making myself fade into the shrubbery, but then I remembered why I had gone to the garden in the first place, to find Claire and Babette. It could have been worse. Claire could have seen me using Michelle's phone. She could have wondered who I was calling, here outside the restaurant in secret. Claire! I waved. Then I walked toward them. Babette was still holding a hanky to her nose, but there were no more tears to be seen. Paul, my wife said. She looked straight at me as she spoke my name. First she rolled her eyes, then breathed an imaginary sigh. I knew what that meant because I had seen her do it before. The time, for example, when her mother tried to take an overdose of sleeping pills at the rest home. It's a lot worse than I thought, the eyes in the sky said. Now Babette looked at me as well. She took the hanky away from her face. Oh, Paul, she said. Dear sweet Paul. The main course has arrived, I said. Chapter 19. There was no one in the men's room. I tried all 3 cubicles. They were unoccupied. You two go ahead, I said to Claire and Babette when we'd reached the entrance. Go ahead and stir. I'll be there in a minute. I went into the cubicle farthest from the door and locked it behind me. For appearance's sake, I pulled my trousers down around my ankles and sat. My underpants I kept on. I took Michelle's phone out of my pocket and slid it open. On the display, I saw something I hadn't seen before, at least something I didn't notice out in the garden. At the bottom of the screen, a little white box had appeared. 2 missed calls. Faso. Faso?
Who the hell was Fatso? It sounded like a made-up name, a name that couldn't really belong to anyone. And suddenly I knew, of course, Fatso! Fatso was a nickname Rick and Michelle had given their adopted half-brother and half-cousin. Beau. Because of the country he was born and because of his first name, Beau Fatso, B. Fatso from Burkina Faso. They had started it a couple of years back, at least that was the first time I'd heard them use the nickname at Claire's birthday party. You want some Fatso? I heard Michelle say as he held it up to Beau, a red plastic bowl of popcorn. And Serge, who was standing close by, heard it too. Please, he said, cut that out. His name is Beau. Beau himself seemed to be the last person to be bothered by his nickname. It's okay, really, Dad, he said to my brother. No, it's not okay, Serge said. Your name is Beau, Fatso. I don't know, I think it's just not nice. Serge had probably meant to say, I just think it's discrimination, but had bitten his tongue at the last moment. Everyone's got a nickname, Dad. Everyone. That was what Beau wanted. He wanted to be like everyone. After that, I had rarely heard Michelle and Rick use the nickname when other people were around, but apparently it had lived on, all the way to Michelle's list of contacts. What had Beau/Fatso been calling Michael about? I could listen to the voicemail if he'd left a message, but then Michelle would see it right away that I'd been poking around in his phone. We were both on Vodata phone, and I could have recited the voicemail lady's message in my sleep. You have one message. Changed after the first time it was listened to into you have one old message. I pushed the select button, clicked on through to File Manager and then to Videos. A drop-down menu appeared. 1. Videos. 2. Downloaded videos. 3. Favorite videos. Just as I had a few hours, an eternity ago, in Michelle's room, I clicked on number 3, Favorite videos. Even more than an eternity, it had been a turning point. A turning point as in before the war or after the war. The still of the most recent video was outlined in blue. This was the film clip I had already watched an eternity ago. I clicked back on one video, pushed by options, then play. A station. The platform at a station. A subway station by the looks of it, yes. An above-ground subway station out in one of the suburbs. Judging from the high-rise apartments in the background, maybe the southeast side of town or else slow turf forest. I might as well be frank. I recognized the subway station. I knew right away which subway station it was and where and along which line. I'm not going to shout it from the rooftop. At this point, there's no one who would benefit from my mentioning the name of the station. The camera panned down and I began following the heels of a pair of white sneakers that were moving down the platform with a certain degree of haste. After a while, the camera swung up again and you saw a man, an older man around 60. I figured, though, with people like him, it's always hard to tell. It was clear in any case that this was not the owner of the white sneakers. When the camera moved in closer, you could see his unshaven, rather spotty face, a panhandler, probably a homeless person, something like that. I felt the same cold that I had felt earlier that evening in Michelle's room, the cold that came from inside. Beside the homeless person's head, Rick's face appeared. My brother's son grinned at the camera. Take one, he said. Action. Then, with no warning, he struck the man on the side of his head with the palm of his hand on the ear. It was a real rabid punch. The head lurched to the side. The man winced and raised his hands to cover his ears, as though to ward off the next blow. You're a piece of shit, motherfucker, Rick screamed in English with a hint of that giveaway accent, like a Dutch actor in a British or American movie. The camera moved in even closer. The homeless man's unshaven face filled the little screen. He blinked his watery red eyes. His lips mumbled something incomprehensible. "Stay, jackass," said another voice off camera, a voice I immediately recognized as my son's. The homeless man's head disappeared, and there was Rick again. My nephew looked into the camera and put on an intentionally stupid grin. "Don't try this at home," he said, and took another swing, or at least his arm made a punching movement, and that the actual blow landed off camera. "Say jackass," said Michelle's voice. The homeless man's head appeared on screen again. This time, judging from the camera angle, there were no longer apartment blocks in the background, only a stretch of gray concrete along the platform and rails behind lying on the ground. His lips trembled, his eyes were closed. Jackass, the man said. There, the frame froze. In that ensuing silence, I only heard the sound of water rushing down the peat wall. "We need to talk about our children," Serge had said. "How long ago? An hour? 2? What I really felt like was staying here until tomorrow morning, until the cleaners found me." I got up. Chapter 20. At the entrance to the dining room, I hesitated. Michelle could arrive at any moment to pick up his cell phone. He hadn't yet. In any case, I saw as I took a few steps forward, then stopped. The only people at our table were Claire, Babette, and Serge. I ducked behind a large potted palm. Peeking through the foliage, I didn't have the impression that they'd seen me. By far, the best thing, I reflected, would be to intercept Michelle, here in the entryway or at the cloakroom. Even better, of course, would be outside in the garden. Yes, I needed to go to the garden. That way I could walk up and meet Michelle part way. Give him the cell phone there, not hindered by the looks and possible questions from his mother, uncle, and aunt. I turned and walked outside, past the girl at the left turn. I had no fixed plan. I would have to say something to my son. But what? I decided to wait and see whether he would bring anything up himself. I would pay close attention to his eyes, I resolved. His honest eyes that had always been so bad at lying. Following the path with the electric torches, I took the turn to the left, just as I had earlier in the evening. The most obvious thing would be for Michael to take the same route we had across the footbridge, opposite of the regular people's box. There was another entrance to the park, in fact, that was the main entrance, but then he would have to cycle a lot farther in the dark. When I reached the bridge, I stopped and looked around. There was no one in sight. The light from the restaurant's torches was no more than a weak, yellowish glow here, no brighter than a pair of candles. The darkness had an advantage, too. In the dark, when we couldn't see each other's eyes, Michelle might be more willing to speak the truth. And then what? What was I going to do with that truth? I rubbed my eyes and needed to appear lucid in any case later. Cupping a hand in front of my mouth, I exhaled and smelled. Yes, my breath smelled of alcohol, of beer and wine. But until now, I calculated I had a total of no more than 5 drinks. I resolved beforehand to remain in control. I didn't want to give Serge the chance to score me off this evening just because I was sloppy. I knew myself well enough. I knew that a dinner out had a certain limited curve of concentration, and that by the end of that curve I would no longer have the oomph to come back at him if he started in about our children again. I looked at the other side of the bridge in the lights of the bar behind the bushes on the far side of the street. A tram rode past the stop without slowing down. After that, it was silent again. "Hurry up now," I said out loud, and it was there, at that precise moment, as I heard the sound of my own voice, was jolted awake by the sound of my own voice. I should perhaps say that I suddenly knew what I had to do. I took Michelle's phone out of my pocket and slid it open. I pressed show. I read both text messages. The first one contained a phone number, and the comment that had no message had been left. The second said that the number had left one new message. I compared the times under the 2 texts. Between the first and the second there had only been 2 minutes. Both had arrived just a little bit more than 15 minutes. While I was talking to my son on the phone, in this same park, just a little way from here, I pressed options twice, then hit delete. Then I called the number on the voicemail. When Mitchell got his phone back later, there would be no missed calls listed on the display, I reasoned, and therefore no reason for him to consult his voicemail, at least not for the time being. "Yo," I heard then, after the voicemail lady had announced that there was one new message and 2 old ones. "Yo, you gonna call me back or what?" Yo. About 6 months ago, Bo had started adopting the Afro-American look, with a New York Yankees cap and matching lingo. He had been taken from Africa and brought here, and until a short while he had always spoken proper, standard Dutch. Not the Dutch spoken by ordinary people, but the Dutch of the circle surrounding my brother and his wife, supposedly quite neutral, but in fact with the accent recognizable among thousands as that of the elite, the Dutch you hear on the tennis court and in the canteen at the hockey club. There must have been a day when Bo had looked in the mirror and decided that Africa was synonymous with pitiful and needy, but despite his own prim diction, he would never be a Dutchman either. So it was perfectly understandable for him to go looking for his identity elsewhere, on the far side of the Atlantic, in the black neighborhoods of New York and Los Angeles. From the very beginning, though, there had been something about this act that annoyed me terribly. It was the same thing that had always annoyed me in my brother's adopted son, something about his aura of sainthood, if you could call it that, the shrewdness of which he exploited his differentness from his adopted parents, his adopted brother, his adopted sister, and cousin. As a little boy, he had climbed onto mother's lap much more often than Rick or Valerie did, usually in tears. Babette would caress his little black head and speak comforting words, but she was already looking around to find who to blame for Bo's sorrow. The guilty party was usually not far away. "What happened to Bo?" she would demand accusingly of her biological son. "Nothing, Mama," I heard Rick say once. "All I did was look at him." In fact, Claire had said when I aired my dislike of Bo, "You're a racist." "No, I'm not," I said. "I would be a racist if I liked that little hypocrite simply for the color of his skin or where he comes from. Positive discrimination. I would only be a racist if our adopted nephew's hypocrisy made me draw conclusions about Africa in general or Burkina Faso in particular." "I was only kidding," said Claire. A bicycle was coming across the bridge. A bicycle with a headlight. I could see the rider only in silhouette, but I could have picked my own boy out of a crowd of thousands, even in the dark. The way he sat hunched down over the handlebars, like a racing cyclist, the supple nonchalantness with which he let the bike sway left and right while the body itself barely moved. These were the ways and moves of a predator. The thought popped into my mind without me being able to stop it. Of an athlete was what I had meant to say, to think. A sportsman. Mitchell played soccer and tennis, and 6 months ago he had joined a gym. He didn't smoke, was very moderate with alcohol. He had on more than one occasion expressed his disdain for drugs. Both sucked and hard. "Those losers" was what he called the potheads in his class, and we, Claire and I, were all too pleased to hear it. Pleased to have a son who was not a delinquent, who rarely skipped school and always did his homework. He was not an exceptionally good student. He never went out on his way to excel. In fact, he barely did more than the bare minimum. On the other hand, there was never any complaint. His marks and exam scores were usually average. It was only for Jim he ever received an A+. "Old message," the voicemail lady said. I realized only then that I was still holding the cell phone to my ear. Mitchell was already halfway across the bridge. I turned my back to him and began walking toward the restaurant. Whatever happened, I had to break the connection as quickly as possible and stuff the phone back into my pocket. "Tonight's okay," Rick's voice said. "We'll do it tonight. Call me. Ciao." After that, the voicemail lady announced the time and date the message had been left. I heard Mitchell behind me, his bike tires crunching on the gravel. "Old message," she said again. Mitchell cycled past me. What did he see? A man rambling through the park all alone, holding his cell phone to his ear? Or did he see his father,
with or without the cell phone. "Hi, love," I heard Claire's voice say now at the same moment that my son went by. He cycled on to the lit gravel path and climbed off his bike. He looked around quickly, then walked his bike to the left of the entrance. "I'll be home in an hour. Your father and I are going to go to the restaurant at 7. I'll make sure we stay awake till after midnight, so you two have to do it tonight. Your father doesn't know anything about this, and I just want to keep it that way. Bye, love. See you in a little bit. Big smooch." Mitchell had locked his bike and was walking toward the door. The voicemail lady mentioned that the date today and the time, 2 in the afternoon, that this last message had been left. "Your father doesn't know about any of this." "Mitchell!" I shouted. I slipped the cell phone into my pocket. He stopped and looked around. I waved, and I want to keep it that way. My son came toward me along the gravel. We met precisely at the top of the path. It was awfully well lit, but maybe I was going to need this much light, I thought. "Hi," he said. He was wearing his black knit cap with the Nike logo. The headphones were slung around his neck, the cable running down the collar of his jacket, a green quilted Dolce & Gabbana jacket he had bought with his own clothes allowance only recently, after which there was no money left for socks and underpants. "Hi, Guy," I said. "I figured I'd walk up a bit and meet you." My son looked at me, his honest eyes, frank. That was how you would have to describe his gaze. "Your father doesn't know any of this." "You were talking on the phone," he said. I said nothing. "Who were you talking to?" He was trying to sound as casual as possible, but there was an urgent undertone to his voice. It was a tone that I had never heard there before, and I could feel the hair standing up on the back of my neck. "I was trying to call you," I said. "I was wondering what was taking you so long."